Thank you very much. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. The topic of the panel is Voices of Nature Writing Non-Human Worlds, but I do need to include non-adult worlds as well. So let's rethink our, how are we looking at the world? So yeah, when we were thinking about this panel, the idea was that in the history of civilization, often our stories have included humans at the center of the drama, and the nature, the trees, the land, the wind, the insects, the flowers, the birds, the butterflies, they all become a landscape to the theater and the drama of our lives. And the idea today with this session is to rethink that because we are, funnily, in the paradox where the scientists have called it the epoch of Anthropocene, which means, just to illustrate, that it is a moment in the geological time that is being used to describe that this is the most recent period in Earth's history when human activity has started to have a significant impact on planet's climate and ecosystems. And hence the paradox. In our stories, we continue to remain the central part of our stories, but what is happening around us is not finding its way into our stories, our fiction, our art, our literature yet. And especially when we go back, because it is a literary festival, some of the writers who have been trying to work on this topic, there are genres that are allocated to it. It is called science fiction, speculative fiction, climate fiction. And it is very difficult to bring this question in this mainstream literature. It still does not find that space. And then the question is like, what does this tell us about ourselves? Why is art and literature struggling with this? Coming back also to the context we are in Kenya, we've been talking about how the rains are coming later. The dry season has been lasting longer. So there is the fact that something that was more probable has become improbable. But when we write in our literature, the tornadoes and the cyclones are the backdrop where something happens to us, or when the rains happen, a couple falls in love. Voilà. We got the non-adult voice in as well. Yeah.
Thank you, baby.
So, so yeah, coming back, the topic is the sea is history, and the idea was also like going back to the opening that we had with Alea, where she asked us, what does the sea mean? And there were a lot of conversations about how the sea is a place where a lot has been taken away from us, the slavery. There are a lot of associations made with the oceans and the lakes. There's also the question of hope that we were talking about, that it's also to reimagine. But the sea in itself holds these plethora of plant life and animal life and dolphins and fish and things that we don't understand. And it is the only place that the humans don't live, apart from the mermaids, of course, that we talk about. But we don't inhabit, we do not understand this ocean. So that is how I wanted to contextualize the conversation that we are going to have today. And I could not have asked for a better panel to have this discussion. We have Dr. Dino J. Martins. He's a Kenyan entomologist. I don't know how many of you know what does He studies ants, bees, and other insects and their interactions with plants. He's the director of the Turkana Basin Institute and a professor at Stony Brook University. Apart from the scientific work that he's a naturalist, artist, prolific writer, and he has written about how the insect life affects an everyday person. And by that, he has written books such as our friends the pollinators, a handbook of pollinator diversity and conservation in East Africa, insects of East Africa, grasses of East Africa. I mean, you can pick up any of those books and I assure you your life will be enriched. Children's books such as Helpful Hannah, Hippo, Raven, and Rover, they are singular because it's really a scientist who has written, and he is able to bring out unique insights that I think children are able to decipher very quickly. So with Kenya National Museum and Nature Kenya, you lead do walks, which I recommend each of you to attend, please, on a Saturday. Please find time and go for it. It is life-changing. And then we have Shubhangi Swarup. You're the author of the highly acclaimed international bestseller, The Latitudes of Longing. It is an Indian bestseller, but also an international bestseller, published in 17 international languages. The book has earned multiple awards, both in India and abroad. The Sushila Devi Women's Writing Award, the Tata Lit Live, and more recently, it also won the translation. It was translated in French, and it was awarded the Emily Guimé Prize for Literature. Most of the critics have tried to find a name for it. They've called it fiction of nature. But the book has invented a genre of its own. So a wonderful, wonderful panelist to have this conversation about non-human voices. Thank you. So before we jump into the book, the literature, I wanted to pose a more personal question because me as a reader wants to know where the wants to know how did the writer come to it. So my first question is, do you have a memory of the first time where the human world became the background and the non-human world became a central preoccupation? I mean, I remember personally that I was 12. My father bought an apartment on the banks of a river. It's called Kharkai. And after that, our everyday conversation changed. We became obsessed with, is the river full? Is the river empty? Are the buffaloes crossing? And I was around 12, 13. So some memories from your childhood?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for being willing to listen. I remember childhood, I grew up in Eldoret. Kenyans will know that. It's in Western Kenya. It was a very small farming, rural community. Now it's just been given city status. You know, it's a growing part of Kenya. But I actually spent another part of my childhood in what was then called Zaire, Eastern DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. And one of my earliest memories, we had very little. I had no television. I know that's hard to imagine. No social media, even harder to imagine in today's world. But I had the insects. And so every day I had to entertain myself after school. I had to figure out, it was quite a difficult time in life. And I just would gravitate towards looking at things around me. And I'll never forget the riverbanks because, I think the interface of the two elements, earth and water, and butterflies would gather there. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of them. And I would just spend hours. And I would try and catch them with my hands, which is hard to do when you're 7 years old. But I would be patient enough that I would catch them. But in the process of sitting there for many hours, escaping a lot of trauma and violence and just sort of trying to heal myself in the forest, I would watch things like an okapi. An okapi is an animal that now only occurs in Congo. There are only a few thousand left in the whole world. They are related to the giraffe. They've been around for millions and millions of years. And the fact is that in our continent of Africa, we have these remarkable, mystical creatures that live and thrive and are part of who we are. And from that moment in the forest, I realized as the okapi would come to the river, the butterflies would come, and I would hear and see and smell and taste and be part of everything around me, that I was not separate from what was happening in the natural world, and neither was it separate from me. So as we become a scientist, I've had to become a scientist, and in science you're trained to draw these lines between things. And actually now as life just goes in interesting circles, I go back to trying to remove the lines between things and say, actually, no, all of it is connected. Thank you.
Yes, I guess those lines are very critical to, or rather, erasing those lines is very critical to my work too. Um, I would like to say that we have this idea of nature as being a postcard, and the people connected to it are also part of that postcard somehow. But I come from a very overpopulated city called Mumbai. We are more than 18 million people. Our rivers are drains. The city just grows one way because there's no space. So, my choice, okay, so one is the earliest memories. Well, I grew up in a house where, like Dino is saying, even the insects were treated with a form of deference. If a cockroach comes and if anyone squealed, my mother would admonish us, like, get a life, it's just a cockroach. So, she graced us with a lot of respect for everything. And when a snail crosses the road, she would stop the traffic. And I can tell you the traffic in my city is much worse than Nigeria. So she would hold up the traffic and say, "Can't you see a snail is crossing?" So we would actually have to wait for the snail to cross. And, it just became intrinsic with that kind of, deference and defiance that there is a lot more here. And living with it in that way, like a plant on the sofa sitting next to you. But I must say that my adult engagement has not been by accident, it's not been by education, it's been a very conscious choice to live without nature, or um, what shall I say, an appreciation of nature is like living without love. Really, you must come, I don't know how you live, but I have lived with enough pollution to know the value of what I'm being deprived of. So, I mean, one example I gave is I can sit alone on a railway station and I may still feel lonely and a bit scared, quite scared actually in India. But if I sit alone on a mountain or nature, it's such a beautiful experience because it's not loneliness, but part of something. So it's a very emotional, it's a strongly emotional choice I've made to, you know, look at the sea and not my city sometimes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, there were so many things that you brought up, both in what you were talking about, but the first thing that I wanted to pick out is that both of you have sort of worked with your imagination in a certain way. You as a child, um, looking at the joy and the pleasure that you found in living in the nature, and you, even today, when you look at the ocean instead of the pollution. And then I want to, because both of you are writers, how do you, what do you think about why does a lot of the literature lack this imagination? What is it about our language that is stopping us? And if this question may seem rather large, which I do understand, maybe you can talk about what are the techniques you are using in your own works, because both of your writing is very compelling, where both of you help us to get out of our bodies and our angst to the animals, to the insects, to the millipedes. Please, whoever wants to go first.
Thank you. Uh, I come from a deeply patriarchal culture, and I am somewhere at the bottom of the pyramid as when I was writing a young woman who wants to write in different places and explore. And I must say, my vulnerability became my superpower in a way, and my invisibility also. When a straw, like, I can't say how do I explain this? If I go to take someone's interview, they think either I'm a student doing a PhD or they just tell me, go away. you know. So in a way, that vulnerability and invisibility, like literally being a tree or a fly, helped me identify and explore parts of the story that other people probably just cross across. It became a point of connection. I could sit with a gecko or a crab in their company and an earthworm and appreciate it. You know, if I share such a big room with a baby gecko, I'm aware of it. And to anyone who's, even if you haven't read my novel, the cover has that baby gecko on it. And so many of the little insects who became my companions in that way. So I think my vulnerability and my fears, you know, I can only work in the daytime. I'm very scared to work out at night. It's a quite a violent, unpredictable part of the world. That opened me up to a different kind of story, and I thought that was quite liberating. Um, does that answer your question? And it's about the imagination, right? So I find honestly, like when we say human, 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 I want to say it's the human ego. This is not my humanity. This is the ego talking. So it's actually really exhausting to think from the human ego all the time. You know, if I just look at my individual story, it's tiring. Even to, you know, to keep differentiating is exhausting. It's actually a lot more effortless to just flow and let the story and everyone take you. To think as an ecosystem is actually um, much easier. To just think of me alone is tiring.
That's very powerful, thank you. And it very much connects to what I think about this. It is a Western philosophy of the self. We think about Tillich, those of you who've read some of the philosophers, talks about how we are fundamentally alone. And my dad reads Tillich, and he reads a lot of philosophy. And it's very powerful, but it's actually very sad. If we're that alone, and I would be like, but actually, no, we're not alone. Because I want you to think about, even as you sit here, or wherever you will be, for your whole life, you will always be within a few inches of an insect, no matter where you are, unless you're living deep in the ocean, where there are other invertebrates, not insects. But there will be ants, the underground termites right here. There will be flies. Some of us have even insects living on us, and that's wonderful. We've evolved with them for millions of years. And other creatures will always be part of your immediate sensory environment, whether you're aware of it or not. So I think the idea is that we better think that less of ourselves and more of ourselves as an extension of the earth around us. You know, today humans are the dominant force on the planet, there's no question. I was just teaching in the field with my students. We catch and we weigh insects. I mean, this is a long-running study I've had. And we count elephants, and we count giraffes, and we count cows, and we count wildebeest, and we count humans, and we count grasshoppers. And of all of those, even in a world that is changing so much, today in the savannas in East Africa, the grasshoppers are 10 times the biomass of everything else, which is quite remarkable. And so in Nairobi National Park, in 1 square kilometer, you have several tons of grasshoppers. They eat 5 times their own weight every day, so more than the elephants. And whenever I do this with the students, they think, oh, the elephant is the ecosystem engineer. It's the keystone species. We know how important they are. They're very important. But we neglect and we forget to think about actually the smallest creatures can have the biggest impact and are having an impact on us. And I think for me, coming to the writing has been very much about how can I share the sense of wonder that I was given. I was given because of my mother. And then I was adopted. And I have 3 mothers, basically, that have raised me. But each of those mothers, the one thing they gave me or they made sure I had was, in addition to nurturing and caring for me, was that I had the space. And that they reminded me constantly about kindness. You know, my biological mother was a Christian. Her Christian faith was a very important part of her life, but her Christian faith and the way she manifested it was also about love and tolerance and respect for all living things. With my foster mother, two foster mothers, they both also emphasized that as well and said, whatever you become as a scientist, don't change too much of who you are. So I would say all of you are all people of nature. We know we're all Africans. We all originate from this continent. We go out in the world, we label, we segregate, we divide, we classify, we lose it. And I think so much of life is striving to come back to that. I wrote a book on grasses. It took 20 years to get it published because publishers are like, grasses, Dino, honestly. And I'll tell you something interesting about the grasses book. So it's reached a lot of people. After 20 years, the publisher published it. It sold out in 3 months. They've reprinted it. Lots of people are talking and thinking, the stuff you stand on out there, humanity would not have evolved without grasses. I mean, we can talk about that another time. But the most amazing thing happened the other day. I was giving a talk in a part of Kenya, again, rural, lots of farmers, lots of people working with livestock. And one of the ladies stood up and she said to me, Dino, what I've done is I've taken the Bible away from my bedside table and I've replaced it with your book on grasses. And before I go to sleep now, rather than reading a verse from the Bible, I read one of the descriptions of one of the species. And I thought, that's what we need. We need to replace the Bible. Bible is important, but we also need to have the other stories as well that are part of who we are. Because, we're made of grass, we're made of bees, we're made of milk, which comes from camels and all these other species. We're just part of this landscape, and we mustn't ever forget it. Thanks.
I mean, thank you so much for that. I think I'm still digesting all that you've said. And, now my intention here is that I think the audience has seen that you both have clearly done something and built that capacity to look around the little insects and the flowers and the grasses that are around. So on the behalf of the audience here, I want you to help us understand what do you do? I mean, how have you developed ways to see better, listen better, immerse yourself in these environments? Because we are being taught to get away from ourselves and go to that telephone, to that various other moments of distraction. So please, whatever you have done in order to reduce the distraction and to sit with the insects and the geckos, please illustrate. I think everything is helpful. And I will continue with the second part of the conversation, of the question, which is, Dino, you were trained as a scientist, and as you were saying, that you were taught ways in which things were classified, and then you have done the work of becoming a writer and writing for different types of literature, both for children, for adults. Shubhangi, you came from the other end, where you went in and looked through, I imagine, scientific journals and trained yourself to understand. So tell us more about how do you, as someone who's a non-scientist, feel about accessing this information? How did you feel as a scientist to change your language? Because a lot of the writers and creators and artists in this room are constantly also changing media, changing language. What was your process?
That's a hard question, yes. So let me take you back again to childhood. Rural Kenya, very little access to books. The school had a little library, but we just didn't have that something for me to channel that energy from. I'm immersed in this wonderful environment. I want to make sense of it better for me and to understand and connect. And so what I did is I started inventing my own classification system. because I didn't have access to what was the Western scientific system until I came to visit the National Museum here, and then I realized there's actually a very elaborate system. I don't have to invent my own system. But coming from that to today, I think for all writers, for all of us, so first of all, just like we're all connected as part of nature, we're also all scientists. The scientific way of thinking is a human way of thinking. It's not different. We tend to put scientists in a box or elevate them on a pedestal. That's not right. Scientists are as fragile, as vulnerable, as creative, as prone to procrastination, as fallible as everybody else. And so what I do as a scientist, as a writer, is just say, I will immerse myself. And the most critical thing is time. I was just down at the coast, went snorkeling, and just said, okay, I'm just going to spend an hour in the sea, just looking at things, just looking. And so I think allowing yourself that freedom and space to just go and look and think. What I find really grounds me and helps me a lot, because we all have that arrogant ego in us that sort of trying to push us, deadlines and everything else, ambition, is spending time with young people and with children. When I first wrote the children's book, I was actually advised, even by one of the publishers, that, are you sure you want to write a children's book? Because you're a very highly respected scientific writer, you may diminish your standing as a scientist. I said, no, I really feel strongly about this, and I want to do this. And I had actually done it already, I just never was brave enough to get the stories published, which is another battle, as you know. So getting that moment back with young people, thankfully through my students, but also just things like the insect walks, the doo-doo walks, which we do from the museum and all over the country, that just gives you a moment to be like, okay, everything else is out of the way. And when you see the look on someone's face, I was just with a group of farmers, and we're talking about insects, and farmers are like, very skeptical and conservative around the world. And there I am saying, actually, insects are our friends, and they're valuable, and we must love them, and love them. We want to get rid of them. So I have a small microscope, and we looked at aphids, which, yes, they are feeding on people's plants. But did you know aphids give birth to young that are giving birth already themselves? Yes. And I got the farmers to look through the microscope and watch the aphid grandmother giving birth to her daughter and granddaughter at the same time. And you can imagine the look on their faces. And from that space, we're now able to have another conversation that actually, yes, we do need to think about the aphid. And what you do to it, you are also doing to your own body and to your daughter and to your granddaughter as well, to the soil, to the water, to the air. So that for me is the challenge, is how can we as writers, all the people in the creative space, find that connection, and we must strive for it constantly. It doesn't come easily.
So I feel like, we look at human breakthroughs to be AI, going to the moon, and all these exciting things. But to me, it feels like that breakthrough will come from the heart, when I can make my humanity large enough to include the universe. That should be the breakthrough for me, which is why I feel artists or scientists, whoever takes this forward, it doesn't have a profession. Even a chef could be, practicing. I feel like that should be our breakthrough, if we want to continue appreciating and enjoying the planet. So for me, it's literally, in this very practical way. Of course, we use all our senses, but the most important sense is in the heart. Sometimes I can hear it very clearly, but I keep doubting it. like, oh, no, the story isn't the politics. Oh, no, I must, speak about something social realism or blah, blah. But my heart is telling me just, what's that ant doing there? Can it come into the story? Or I'm actually scared of a ghost. Like, I keep saying I don't need to believe in ghosts to be scared of them, which is why I have so many ghosts in my book, because I somehow the cheapest places to live in many of the rural areas have a ghost coming free with it, because they are haunted places and they're decrepit. So I'm just saying, a lot of people want to be part of the story, and the heart tells you they're knocking, they have some role to play, but the mind tells us, oh, I want to be really cool, let me speak about the independence movement going on. So just trust your heart, it will take you to places, your senses will take you. It's a switching off, and the more we switch off, the stronger that voice gets. I think there is one thing that unites artists and scientists, and that's curiosity, and to have an openness. And I have found rigid people in both these fields, and I have learned to avoid them. Sometimes so at the end of my book, I had this idea that it's heavily inspired by geology and the story of the earth. And at the end, I had this vision of the Mount Everest shrinking, not being the highest point because of the violence going on in that region. And to go to a scientist and ask them that can Mount Everest be shrinking is like, oh my God, asking someone like asking a devout, does God exist? So some people were horrified, but some people were like, okay, everything is possible because this is the planet and we don't know much about how it works. As one scientist said, we know lesser about East Tibet than we know about the moon, you know? So then you start working with these are the laws we are aware of, but we don't know if they are the rules. These seem to be patterns. And how are possibilities, how can something be possible? So I find that curiosity and having an open mind is crucial to letting the imagination um, unleash itself. Yeah.
So I want to bring you back to the writing because we are at a literary festival, and then I was hoping that with you I can come back to the original point I was trying to make, is that since the fact that the climate change is becoming a lot more, I think even if people don't know the scientific language, everybody on the streets understands how there's been a change happening. However, in the art and even in the movies that is being produced, you see that there is almost a vilification of these natural elements now. So there is a family at the coast of in somewhere in the US, and there's a tornado that comes and a cyclone has come, and that cyclone has disrupted the lives.
It's evil somehow.
And it's evil, exactly. And so in a certain way now, before it was the backdrop to our lives, where there was a palm tree or different things that were basically ornamentalizing our lives, and today now they vilify. What do you guys think about how do we break out of these structures that somehow our human mind is not able to encapsulate? And then I don't want to stick to a negative mood. I wanted to bring the conversation back to East Africa, where we are at Macondo at Nairobi. And in your book, Dino, you said that not only the humans, but the butterflies migrated out of East Africa. And there's something about the fact that this conversation makes sense here, because there is a joy and there is a pleasure that a lot of us here in this region have with the trees, the nature. And then I come back to the writers and the creators and the artists. How do we go back to this pleasure that we have in living with these beings that both of you were talking about, and especially for Kenyan writers in the room, call out to them. How do Kenyan writers, East African writers spearhead the process of really bringing in, not only through the dystopic part, but the other parts of this conversation? I'm posing long questions, I agree, but then I allow you to meander.
Very important question. I'll jump in quickly on the Kenyan writers, my fellow Kenyans. Go out and see the rest of the our beautiful country and meet people and get out of your comfort zone. And we have 2 campuses in northern Kenya. One of them is 600 kilometers from the nearest town. I'm going to bring some of the Macondo writers up there, and they're trapped. And then how are they going to tell the story? Because you'll only get food if you write. And
I assure you, I'll be getting a three-course meal. I'll be so excited.
But to say to Kenyans, actually, we're so privileged. Kenya is a blessed country. Yes, we have challenges, but let us never forget the biggest blessing we have is each other, but also the space, the soil. This is where people, humanity evolved and migrated out over millions and hundreds of thousands and thousands of years. Come and see the fossils, come and touch them. We have the oldest tools. You know, we're all using technology. The oldest stone tools are here in Kenya, 3.3 million years old. We don't even know which species of early hominid made them. Those stories we have access to by just being here are deep and really, really true, and we need to connect with them. So I would say, you know, get involved, get engaged, explore, join festivals, go into these spaces and just be part of it. And, you know, feel free to ask questions, feel free to be uncomfortable and make others uncomfortable and challenge yourself and others. That's how to do it, yeah.
As the writer here, I'll take the first question, which is this idea of dystopia and this genre called cli-fi, climate fiction. I distance myself from it a lot. It's an insult because I find this is this is a Western construct. There are many non-Westerners writing about nature, or I can't say writing about nature. The stories are set in nature and the relationships are explored in so many different ways. But this is one way which, like, the KFC has taken over. But it is a Western construct. I feel like, you know, first they used to have those films where the Nazis were the enemies. Now they've just replaced that with some kind of dystopian environmental thing. Just a silly example, I thought George Clooney was a great actor and very good looking. And then I saw a movie he directed where it's very bizarre, you know. He's in some last outpost in, I think, the Arctic or Antarctic. And first of all, this idea of frozen barrenness, I know we were discussing, you know, this idea of a desert being barren is a Hollywood idea because so much of life thrives even in different climates and landscapes. So we must reject that idea of a hero and a villain and this cause and effect tightly knit plot where, you know, humanity is going to survive. I feel, firstly, life will survive. We may not, and let's stop conflating all of life with human beings. That's where the ego comes in, you know. Thank you. So if I could make a clarion call, I would say let us interact with each other and form those other voices of diversity and different stories and interactions and relationships with nature. So another voice also emerges besides this dystopian one. Yeah.
Thank you.
I
Please
just
go ahead.
quickly want to emphasize that we cannot look at a future where we narrow our worldview to now where we are fighting the elements and the planet for survival. It's just not how it works. It's not who we are. We are the elements, and we are part of its survival and its rebirth and its resurrection and its death. And, you know, there are sites in Turkana that get to 50 degrees Celsius, and they're full of life, including human life. There are sites that get to 60 degrees Celsius, and they have life, occasionally human life. There are sites, there's a site that gets to 73 degrees Celsius. It is full of life. Not human, but other life forms as well. We need to understand that and be humbled by it.
If I can, something that resonates with me, what we do to the elements, we do to us, is, we now have microplastics in the womb, and we have them in our brain. And as someone who has recently had 2 children, the thought really struck me. I try to eat organic food and avoid ketchup. And here there is, microplastics in the amniotic fluid, which is what my baby's using to grow, and my brain. So it is not outside of me anymore. Yes, and one thing I really, I find like fiction is a great space for me to explore is this division of sentience and non-sentience. I feel like it's my human stupidity that makes me think these are unsentient beings. It's like a, catch-22. Because why have we defined consciousness in such a limited way that excludes an ocean, a mountain? Why, after so many thousands of years, am I still looking at eyes and a brain and a nose as a sign of consciousness? So fiction allows me to explore this thought quite well, I guess.
Thank you, Dino and Shubhangi. That was the panel for us, and I will be opening now for the questions from the audience. So yes, we will have the questions. Okay, one year. There's the mic that is just coming. I did want to just talk about also, because we spoke a lot about the human migration across the oceans, and I very recently discovered that trees migrate as well. And it was one of those moments where, I had such a revelation. Yes, please. Please, can I ask you to introduce yourself? Just please tell your name and then your question.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anne Mora. This is so much sparks. This is delightful. Thank you so much. 2 questions, or 2-part question. I'm really interested in the scientists will correct me if I'm using the language correctly, like the not living parts of nature. So not the insects or even amoeba or whatever, but like the soil and the cyclone and the wind and the elemental side maybe, or the things that are not living literally, and what your approach is when it comes to writing those. I think it's easy to anthropomorphize too much, where you become like, and they also have an ego and think like humans. But when you're talking about elemental parts of nature, how do you approach that? And the second part is, and you mentioned ghosts, how does the mythical or fantastical or whatever, the ogres and jinn and angels and these kind of like imaginative spaces, how does that interact with your work when you're coming to, do you use those when you're talking about nature? How do those elements, those fantastical elements, interact with nature?
Do you use supernatural in your work also?
Truth is stranger than fiction, as they say, and so yes, I do.
Yeah.
There's definitely an energy to everything, including things we can't explain as scientists.
Yes. So I think someone described my works as a creation myth based on science. And I feel like even this dichotomy between science and supernatural, or research and intuition, again, is a Western paradigm, I feel like if we just engage without judgment, then we find that the nomenclature may have changed, but we're tapping on to something. So I try not to judge. And I have the ghost of an extinct sea. So just as an example of how I use this, my book begins with the ghost of a goat, because it is this arranged marriage between a staunch vegetarian and her carnivorous husband. And she's telling him that I hear the cries of all the animals you've eaten and I can't sleep. And he gets really fed up and he says, I'll become vegetarian. Because he's like, I can't call her schizophrenic, she's my wife, but this is getting, And because it began with a simple curiosity. If we can see the ghosts of humans, why can't we see the ghosts of animals? Then I started playing with it that if we can see ghosts of animals, then can we see ghosts of extinct creatures? We should be able to see the ghosts of dinosaurs too then. Then again, I started thinking a little more, and then I was like, can we see the ghosts of elements, like an extinct ocean? That is something that fascinates me, is where I come from, was all an ocean once, the Tethys Sea. And I realized that she is the true architect of my novel, because she has created the so much of this is linked. The creation of the Himalayas, India, its position, where it ended up right now, has led to this ocean not vanishing but changing. So I anthropomorphized her biography into the ghost of an ocean. But I read a lot of scientific literature on the Tethys to come up with that character.
There was another question in the back
Yeah.
of the room.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I would like for you to comment whether do you have conversations with nature, animals, plants, or elements? Would you define it in that way? And if you so, could you comment on that process?
So, yes, and yeah, my scientific colleagues are all rolling their eyes right now. Absolutely. I mean, we all talk to animals, and that's, I think, just an innately part of being human. Now, how we allow our senses to connect with elements, whether it's warmth or cold or the saltiness of the sea or the heat of the sand. So I find actually just being out there, I love walking, I just love sitting and watching, and I do this with my students. It's hard these days, it's getting harder and harder to get students to sit for 5 minutes without going into sort of withdrawal shock from mobile phones and things. But for those who are able to do it, become better scientists, they become better writers. So I think the sensory part of the world, we keep denying ourselves. And it's a sensual pleasure as well. We have more nerves in our lips and fingertips and in our skin and our eyes than in many other parts of the body that we think are important. And why deny yourself that pleasure of actually feeling and being connected? So I think that for me is one approach. I'm sure there are many other approaches. But I would like to point out that many, quote unquote traditional cultures, because I think there's only one human culture, there's no traditional or modern, but many of the cultures that remain deeply connected with themselves and the world of nature don't draw those boundaries. There is no boundary between the amniotic fluid and the sea, which is more or less the same, environment that we evolved in. So that lack of boundary, I think, is the important place to find.
I think a large part of this is questioning that conception that knowledge lies in libraries and books. What if we start treating even other human beings as books, which means their stories become important, their pauses, their tonality, their worldview. And then we, also extend this to, can a shell be a book? Can an insect be a book? Can a rock be a book? And by that I mean that, how do we read them? Now, you have given a great example of this being a sensory experience. And because I'm a writer, I'm limited to using the word reading. But like a shell with its spirals is telling me a story. The layers on a rock are telling so many stories. The Himalayas used to be a seabed. And you see that in the layers. You see fossils in the mountains. That is an obvious example of what the story is telling you, that it used to be an ocean bed. Mount Everest used to be an ocean bed. And as this geologist pointed out, there are all these layers we read, and then we see one layer where the mass extinction took place and majority of life vanished. And that's a dramatic moment. It's just the layer. But if we start reading these various stories, then it just enriches my knowledge system also. So I feel like there is always a story. It, like, once again, it may not come and tell you like, hello, hi, this is where I was born, but I must train myself to listen to that story. I feel the sea or the waves or sitting on the beach is a very powerful experience. There are so many stories being told, but if only we keep our phone down. Literally, I've seen on Juhu Beach, it's a very populated beach and it's my home, so I love it. Sometimes there have been 30 dolphins in the sea, but the people don't notice it because they are on their phone and they're just taking pictures of themselves. And I do that, then I just tell them, keep your phone down. Have you seen the dolphins? It's literally that, 30 dolphins, and people haven't spotted it because we're so busy leading our lives.
Wow, I don't know whether you all felt it, but the metaphors, the amniotic liquid in the ocean, and what you spoke about the rocks, I could feel it really within me, and I hope to carry it with me even out of this conversation. But please, we still have time for more questions. Writers, artists, if you have other questions about how would you want to access, please don't hesitate. If there are, oh yeah, there's a question, great. There is no problem because I can get them to talk about insects and we can continue talking about insects for an hour.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful session. It's quite informative and insightful. I personally work as a conservationist. I write a lot. A major part of my work is essentially translating hard text to creatively portray these facts true to what it is to the public. And I do it in a creative way so that it can reach as many people as possible. The only challenge that I face is from my colleagues is like, they don't get it. It's science, them, it's just science. But I get good feedback from the public because it's something that they get to learn so much that's just within us. So my question is there space for creative writing in science, in conservation? That's the first question. The second thing is we work where I come from. I come from near Eldoret, and we are trying to bring back the Sitatunga to try and sort of, conserve and preserve it. It's not working because there's a lot of resistance from the community. Most of the communities are very poor, and they're trying to essentially just survive and take their children to school. So poaching, there's no such word. They just, you could just, if there's a Sitatunga, it's meat. So that's it. So how do you have a way of translating what you've written, amazing work, by the way, to the community, to the local community, and how have you done that? Thank you.
First of all, thank you for what you do. That's really important, and we need many more people like you. And please keep doing it, even if your colleagues are saying it's, we need that voice to be heard. Stick with it and keep doing it. It's, I think one of the things now is we've come to this narrative of it's conservation versus development. Again, it comes from this very Western way of thinking. It's black, it's white. It's gay, it's straight. It's male, it's female. You're either with us or you're against us. And we have to get away from that. And it is challenging to do conservation in many places, but keep at it, and you will find there are always within every community people who are longing to be the champions, to be the stewards. What we lack is not the talent or the heart, but is the opportunity. And so I try to focus on how can I create that opportunity, mainly for young people, even if it's just a short-term opportunity, or it's giving them a step to hopefully the next opportunity, there will be a story about the Sitatunga. You know, how can they walk in the swamps and not sink into the mud with their long toes? How did they relate to people? At one point, people and Sitatungas had a common ancestor. That's what I would look for, is to find that. And we have to find it quickly because we're losing it. But once you found it, hold on to it. Don't let it go.
Thank you. Mine really just a comment on sort of the world that we live in. I mean, at home, surrounded by ants and geckos and lizards and monkeys and things, and snails, you know, and you get people saying, you know, they scream if they see a snail, and it's taken like, you know, how do I even take that snail and put it outside without necessarily killing it? But also to deal with ants in the kitchen. You know, people spread insecticides and stuff rather than just take the food away and let them find their own space. So and like, you know, my late partner used to talk to the birds, you know, and now my son does it. You know, it's fascinating that, you know, people have a relationship, you know, with nature. The other thing is when it comes to like I love Harry Potter, and I love all those movies, Star Wars, and they've got fantastic creatures and animation that have been created. And I believe that you know, they're trying to animate a form of how they see nature. I mean, even The Hobbit, for example, the mountains coming to life, you know, and talking to each other. And I find that absolutely beautiful, to say that, you know, this kind of world, you know, exists, coexist, and stuff like that. So finally, I mean, I, as a young man, used to climb a lot of mountains and stuff. And I feel that if I died, I would like to be buried on the mountain with nature. It's basically a calling that I sort of will hold dear the rest of my life.
I'm actually very curious about the intersection of gender and nature, and or maybe it's not an important intersection. It's not something we should think about, but I just feel like there is a certain amount of writing on it, starting from that division between nature and culture in anthropology and you know, other sort of academics, but also on the field. Very often, I think in India, if you go down to forest-dependent communities, there's a sort of division of labor that appears there as well, with women being closer to the forest in terms of, you know, still working as gatherers, going there to like, you know, gather medicinal plants or like herbs and flowers with which they can make things which are, you know, more regulated, relegated to the kitchen, whereas men would go more and look at, you know, what they can extract in terms of animals for medicines and or timber for the house, etc. So there's a certain division of gender there, and I think even in language, when we talk about it, like today when you said amniotic fluids and the ocean, and or the concept of Mother Nature. And so for me, I find it a very confusing space to be in. Like, what is this intersection of gender and nature, and how does one think about it? Or does it not matter at all? Are we thinking about it all wrong?
I'll quickly say something from a biologist's perspective, but I really think Shubhangi needs to comment on that. There is no boundary of gender. There are fungi that have hundreds of different sexes. There are fish that can change from male to female. There are what we call sequential hermaphrodites, so they are first male, then female. Almost all the flowers you see practice an hermaphroditic enantiostyle. There's a tongue twister for you. Which means they can be male first, which they are protandrous if they're male first, or they're protogynous. They're female first and male later. So we as humans, yes, we have culture and biology, but let us not be arrogant and impose it on all the rest of life, because gender is a very, very, very fluid phenomenon.
The the male seahorse gives birth to the eggs, which the woman implants. I would love to have been that female, just hand over and let them, take on. So, you know, fiction is not about what is or what was, it's about what can be. And I'm coming only from that space. I feel nurturing is a fundamental aspect of life. And sometimes these narratives of women as nurturers and women as the tree huggers or the saviors takes that capacity away from men. It's a very tragic thing, it's emasculating, I would find, because I'm here because my husband's looking after my kids. So it's not gender. I think everyone, children look after, animals, they look after their siblings. We all have that capacity for nurturing. Even a baby has that capacity, uh, unless they're curious about life and death and decide to swat something. Generally, that capacity for nurturing is also innate. And sometimes this is, in my culture, this is a trap, especially for women, to also take the responsibility away from um, our patriarchal counterparts. So fiction gives me that leeway to look at it very differently.
We're almost out of time, but there are 2 questions. Can we take 2 questions? Okay, 2 questions.
Sorry for the second question, but this conversation is really interesting. You mentioned a lot the shift from like a binary pattern of thought to a fluidity way. I was wondering whether would you say there are other beliefs or abstract concepts that shape human society and human behavior that kind of need to change when we move from an individualistic perspective to a ecosystem and connected one?
Second question as well.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion. So my question is to both of you. Do you think that trees have a language of their own, something distinct and probably spiritually superior to our understanding, our human understanding of trees and forests?
Why don't I take the second question and then you could no. I think that was a harder question. Absolutely. Can trees communicate? All things have means of communication. There are wonderful scientific books. There's one called Finding the Mother Tree. It's by a scientist, Suzanne Simard, and it's all about her work on fungal mycorrhizal networks and how trees actually talk to each other, how they transmit information. They even share nutrients with non-relatives, going against what we as scientists think should be the purely Darwinian approach to life. So, absolutely. How do we tap into that? Well, one, obviously, scientists are trying to do it, but we're doing it with chemistry and with genetics and with very precise, tools of cutting and sequencing. But I think writers and artists have another way of tapping into it. And I challenge all of the artists, all of us, to figure that other way out.
The question was, how do we break out of the dualistic pattern? Was that the question? Oh, one big one that I deal with is the sentient and this definition of consciousness and sentient and non-sentient. I know, the we had the Colombian embassy host us, and one of the diplomats out there was telling me how Colombia has given rights to the river and the mountains, and how you suggested artists, since we don't carry this burden of precision and repeating the same results. I feel philosophy artists or someone, just someone curious could help us redefine our perspective about consciousness. I really feel it's done a lot of disservice. It's like if to me, this is an ecosystem. I consider my consciousness an ecosystem. It's like me saying my knee is conscious or my brain is only conscious and the rest of me is just a hanger on. But that's what we have done with humanity. We've created this definition of consciousness. We've given ourselves privileges and rights based on it. But how do I shift that? Like this sentient, non-sentient, because that's where the elements come. Yeah.
With that, it is a wrap. I hope you carry the ocean within you even when you leave the room. We're truly never alone. And that is what I hope this conversation has helped us to believe, that we are truly not alone. And as writers and creators, let's take upon the challenge and write the ocean, write the insects, write the skies, write the trees. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was...
For those of you who are young at heart, we have a reading of one of the children's books.
Yes.
Rover, with our wonderful puppeteers Fidelis and Victor, and Raven will be making an appearance.